the course for Procurement Excellence in 2014, brought to you by ProcureCon and sponsored by Zycus. So I'd like to start by introducing today's speakers. Joining us, we have Chris Sawchuk, Procurement Advisory Practice Leader at the Hackett Group, and Richard Waugh, VP of Corporate Development from Zycus. As this is a live webinar, we do welcome you to submit questions using the Questions tab on your control panel, as we'll stop for Q&A at the end and we'll address as many questions as possible. And lastly, we will be sending you the final recorded webinar and slide deck within 24 to 48 hours. So without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to Chris.
Well, thank you, and welcome everybody. What I have today is a presentation talking about the issues that we're seeing in 2014, and the idea of charting a course is as we better understand the kinds of issues that we're dealing with, both from an enterprise standpoint as well as from a procurement standpoint. The idea then is how do we use that to chart a course in terms of where are we headed as we look forward. So to begin, I want to share with you some of these trends that we're seeing. Every year, Hackett goes out to the marketplace and conducts our key issue studies. These studies are done across the enterprise as well as specifically within each function. And in this particular case, I'm going to be sharing some of the insights from the sourcing and procurement function. But before that, I want to share some of the enterprise trends and things that we're seeing across the market. So if you move to the next slide, from an overall standpoint, there are some significant trends that we are seeing. The business environment in 2014 expects to, and most people expect it to be characterized by this idea of volatility and elevated business risk. We're seeing that in the marketplace, especially recently, where we've seen some downturns. Just several weeks ago when the Dow Jones went down about 1,000 points, and the VIX, the indicator of volatility within the stock market, increased quite significantly in a very, very short amount of time. The expectation is we're going to see more of that, and not just within the stock markets, but in the commodity markets, et cetera. While geopolitical and financial risk, over the last several years have, I'll say, been muted more, regulatory risk is something that has become more front of mind for us. There's lots of regulations in the business that have been a concern of us, and it's certainly creating some uncertainty within our environments. When you think about things like conflict minerals and how do we deal with that, and a lot of the other regulatory types of compliance exercises that we have to go through to deal with these kinds of regulations that are not only within our domestic markets within the U.S., but other markets as well. Margin pressure. As we look forward, the pressures on our margin are intensifying. And that's actually being driven by some of the things I was just talking about from a risk standpoint, but also the unpredictability of the demand for the services and products that we produce for the markets, the competition that's coming from many different places, and not only the traditional places that we have seen over the past, and certainly the volatility that I talked about that we're going to be experiencing, but the volatility in the commodity prices, iron ore, et cetera. Enterprises are responding to a lot of this in terms of ensuring that they're tightly managing the costs of their businesses, something we've been focused on over the last 5 years as we came out of the downturn in 2008. One of the things that we saw differently in this particular downturn, different than what we saw in the past, is that we actually continue to focus on the cost. And as our focus as companies started focusing on the top line and growing our businesses, et cetera, more and more, we still kept the focus on the costs. So we would help to and not necessarily impact our margins. And how we're doing this and how we're pursuing some of this growth within our businesses is really driven by innovation. We're looking for innovation ways, innovative new products, new services, innovative ways to go to market to actually grow our organizations, and understanding that we can't save ourselves to success and we have to continue to grow as organizations. To go to the next slide. One of the things that we are continuing to struggle with is some of these external business drivers. I was talking about it in a previous slide, is some of the volatility and risk that's within the marketplace itself. And what we're finding is that there's a number of different things. In this particular area, we asked organizations, what are those things when you think about the business drivers that are out there that are critical as well as moderately an impact on the overall enterprise strategy? And the area that was most critically impactful to our enterprise strategy was the volatility that we're finding on the demand side, and certainly not only finding but expecting on the demand side of our business with our customers in terms of the markets we sell into, the customer bases that we sell into, etc. Threat of competition, but also supply base and supply volatility on the other side of the equation in terms of access to supply and suppliers and the predictability of that supply so we can meet the demand side needs, and trying to match the demands and the volatility and match those on both sides and be able to create a much more predictable model in terms of responding to the needs of the marketplace itself. If you go to the next slide. So while we're focused on that, the risk and the volatility, as management teams within our companies, we're focused on growth. Over the last several years, and when we do these enterprise-type studies of the key issues our companies are focused on, we ask organizations what's top of mind. And what's interesting on the left here, I talk about some of the strategic financial priorities within our companies. What we're finding today is the number one financial priority is focused on growing our revenue and top line of our organizations. And right behind that is improving our margins and profitability. If we go back 2 years ago, what we would have found is that growing our revenue and improving our margins and profitability were equally prioritized in our companies. And if we go back even 2 years beyond that, when we're closer to the 2009 and 2008 kind of time frame, improving our margins was the number one area of focus for organizations. So things have fundamentally changed. So when we look at growing revenue as being our number one financial priority as companies, the question then becomes is how do we actually drive that and deliver on that priority? And as I said earlier, it's really focused around the innovation. Innovation not only in our products and services, but innovation in terms of the way that we go to market. And whether we go to market in some of the traditional ways we have been going to market in the past, are we innovating new ways to go to market? New ways to potentially leverage electronic commerce, etc. If we go to the next slide, one of the other things that we're going to find on an enterprise standpoint in 2014 is that the productivity gap actually increased from what we were seeing in 2013. What we ask here is, organizations is, what is your expected revenue growth as you look into the next year? We ask organizations this question at the tail end of 2013. And what, on average, what they told us, they were expecting fairly significant revenue growth in 2014, growth that would supersede and exceed the growth that we experienced and expected in 2013. At the same time, we ask these same organizations, when you look at across your business service functions, your procurement, your finance, your HR, and your IT functions, etc., what are you expecting to see in terms of the staffing levels and the operating budgets in those particular areas? And what you see here is that from a staffing standpoint, the expectation is that we're going to continue to see reductions in the workforce that we have in these particular business service functional areas. Well, then on the operating budget side, we're expecting a slight increase from what we saw last year, which was a bit of a decrease in terms of our operating budgets. And the way that we determine the gaps here, and certainly the productivity gap when we're comparing revenue growth to the number of staff, is looking at the difference between the 6.7% and the negative 0.7%. And what we see is a total gap of about 7.4% as we go into and go through 2014. So the question then becomes on the next slide is how do we support the 2014 enterprise agenda If these are the types of things our companies are facing and our enterprises are facing in 2014, the volatility, the risk, et cetera, how do we deal with that? Well, one of the things that we have to do is improve the efficiency of our organizations. One of the things that we saw is that our budgets, in terms of our operating budgets as well as our staffing levels, are relatively flat. But we're facing higher demand as we look through the year, which is a good thing. So what that's going to force us to do is continue, not much different than what we've experienced over the last 10 years, to continue to focus on improved efficiency within our organizations. The old model of doing more for less. Retooling, technology investments, certainly is a top area of focus, when we look at how are we going to execute our strategies as we look into the next year. And the same thing is that business intelligence and analytics is not only an important area for procurement, but it's a very important area for our businesses. And it's the #1 area of technology investment and transformation priority within our enterprises. We need to refocus our skills. Talent is certainly a major concern within our organizations. It's not as high in the priority list in terms of focus areas as it was coming out of the downturn. But where we are now is that it continues to be a challenge for organizations. And I'm going to share some insights with you as we look into the procurement in terms of the areas of focus that we have from a sourcing and procurement organization in talent in 2014. We have to re-architect the way that we deliver our services to the organization. And one of the key strategies that organizations are employing here is the utilization of a concept called global business services. It's sort of an extension and elevation of what we used to call shared services within our organizations. So it becomes an area of focus for our organizations in terms of how do we architect not only what goes into our global business services capabilities, but how do we actually deliver that in a systematic way, in an efficient way, and an effective way across our enterprises on a global basis. So if we go to the next slide, what I'm now going to talk about is some of the key issues that we see from procurement. This is all part of the same study. As we do this study, some of the areas that we focus on are really, targeting the enterprise type of level. And I shared a few of the insights, that we received and, gathered from the study that we just completed at the tail end of 2013 from an enterprise standpoint. And now what I want to share with you is some of the insights specifically focused on sourcing and procurement. Go to the next question, next slide. So prior to this webcast, we went out to many of the folks that are on this webcast today and asked them some questions. And the first one that we asked is, if we look into 2014, what is the #1 priority for your overall organization? And what came back was what we see here on this slide. It's that expanding the scope and the influence to support new categories, new value drivers, et cetera, within the organization as a procurement organization is the #1 area of priority in 2014 for our sourcing and procurement organizations. Right behind that, reducing and avoiding purchase costs to take out the costs and in many ways mitigate some of the price inflation that we've been experiencing within the marketplace. And then what you find is some equally important areas around supply risk, around more the quality of the influence and not necessarily just expanding our influencing, but deepening the quality of the influence that we have on specific areas of spend. At the same time, focusing on innovation. Remember, the enterprise that we all support from a sourcing and procurement standpoint, the #1 objective is growing our business and growing our revenue. And how we expect to do that as enterprises is innovation. And so the question is procurement going to enable that objective of our businesses in terms of innovation? What we're seeing here is it certainly is a focus area of our organization going into next year. If we go to the next slide, what I'm sharing here is really the results of the study that we did. So this is the study, again, that was completed at the tail end of last year. When we asked the procurement executives in this particular study, it represented, north of 150, global organizations. What are the things that are most important? And what we found, very similar to what we found in the quick poll that we did just a few days ago, was that expanding the procurement's scope and influence within the enterprise was the #1 priority for the sourcing and procurement organizations. Interestingly enough, as we've been running this study for the last 9 years, the previous 8 years, the #1 area of focus has always been reducing and avoiding purchase costs. This is the first year that the focus on cost reduction and in avoiding cost increases has not been #1 in terms of our key issues looking into the next year. And I think what's really occurring here is that as we look forward and you look at the percentage of spend that procurement organizations are really focused on and influencing across, especially on the indirect side, you're looking at the average organization influencing spend roughly in the 60 to 65% level. Now, I say that from a lot of our benchmark information that we collect. When I've done some recent polls recently, what I found was that roughly 50% of the organizations that were involved in these polls, and this was well over 100 organizations, were less than 50% in terms of the quantity and the percentage of their overall spend that they were actually influencing across the organization. And again, we're primarily focused on the indirect here because the influence is not as much of an issue on the direct side. Now, right behind the area of influencing spend is the area around innovation. And again, when we looked at this, we saw these results, this was very comforting to us because it showed us that we as procurement organizations are aligned and much better aligned to what our enterprises were focused on. Several years ago when we ran this study, innovation was much further down the list. And it was about 2 years ago that our company's focus on growth began to exceed our focus on margin improvement within our companies. And as that started to occur, what you found is that procurement organizations were still focused on reducing and avoiding purchase costs to drive the margin improvement with our business. It's certainly important, but the focus of our companies were changing, and we weren't necessarily changing with it. But the year after that, last year in 2013, our focus on things like innovation and supporting the product and service development within our organizations increased significantly. It was the greatest area of increase in terms of our priorities of any of the areas that procurement was actually focused on. And this year, it actually increased even more, where it's the #2 area of focus for our organizations. Now, if we go to the next slide, we did another survey. So right on the heels of asking organizations, what are the key things and priorities that you're focused on in the upcoming year? The second thing is, what are we doing and what are we going to invest in from a capability standpoint to help us achieve those objectives? And what you see here, #1, was the area around strategic sourcing. Right behind that, areas around category management, as well as measuring and managing the performance of procurement, as well as bringing more visibility to the value that procurement provides back to the organization. And when I say value, I'm actually speaking to broader terms than just spend cost savings and cost avoidance types of value. So if we go to the next slide, and we take a look at what Hackett's study at the tail end of 2013 revealed, was a very similar type of message. The #1 area of focus that we saw, in terms of capability development and where we're going to invest in 2014 was around strategic sourcing. But right in the heels of that was category management, value contribution visibility, and supplier relationship management. Strategic sourcing has always, for the last 9 years we've been running this study, has always been the #1 area of focus. The difference today is the gap between our focus on strategic sourcing and other areas has narrowed. Category management, several years ago, was the middle of this list. So was SRM. And today, we're looking to expand beyond strategic sourcing, and I'll say some of the more traditional sourcing processes that we have to get ourselves much more aligned with the business to other types of value and to support their objectives in a much broader way beyond the focus on improving their margins. And that's what category management allows us to get much more deeper inside the business itself and much better aligned with the businesses and functions that we support. At the same time, getting much more engaged in the suppliers and tapping into those capabilities that exist out there and enabling those capabilities to be utilized in other processes within our business enterprise. So if we go to the next slide, I mentioned earlier, and I showed some slides in terms of what are we seeing in terms of the operating budgets and the staffing levels within our enterprises overall. What you saw there was a slight reduction in the staffing levels expected throughout 2014 with a very small increase in our operating budget. Now, when we narrow that down and drive specifically down to the sourcing and procurement function, what we're seeing is a little bit different story. And in both areas, both in terms of our operating budgets and our staff, we're actually expecting a bit of an increase, very slight. More of an increase in terms of our staff, roughly around 1%, which is similar to what we expected in 2013, but a little bit more in terms of our operating budget. Even though last year it remained roughly flat, this year we're expecting it to go up, just above 0.5% compared to where we were in 2013. Now, if you go to the next slide, what I'm going to talk about now is some of the various areas, and one of the focus areas is technology. And the question then becomes is, when you look at procurement organizations, where are we focused in focusing our technology investment dollars on? And when you look at that, and I would say for the last quite a few years, our focus has been on, I like to say, sort of the blocking and tackling aspects of technology. And what you see here, that it's continuing to ring true as we look into 2014 in terms of rolling out web-based and self-service tools for our employees internally within our companies. But number one is establishing the data stewardship and standardizing our master data, whether it be our vendor master, whether it be our customer master, whether it be our item master, and standardizing that across our organizations. It's always interesting as I go out to organizations and I ask them about some of the things they want to do when it comes to the number 3 thing on this list around business intelligence and analytics. And I hear a lot of wanting to do predictive analytics, et cetera, to be able to think more forward and bring different types of insights to the business as they do their forecasts and think about going forward and not what we have spent, but what we're going to spend. And how can we become much more predictable about that based on the revenue and growth projections of the organization, and even supporting our business in scenario analysis. So, for example, if the business said, we expect our revenue to go up by 10%, what's going to happen to our spend? Is it going to happen the same across every category of spend? The answer is no. And so we have to understand what those relationships are. But these are huge opportunities for procurement to become much more strategic with the businesses that we support. The challenge is we're still trying to master our data. Many organizations are focused on this, and it's not something simple to be done. It's something that takes several years to actually accomplish and develop the quality of the data that we can do some of these more predictive types of things. The other thing I'd like to call your attention to is number 4 on this list. That's investing in collaboration technologies. One of the areas that we find in organizations of focus is the whole area around collaboration, and not just collaborating internally, with our internal functions and our businesses, et cetera, and how do we create more of a collaborative environment? Well, how do we collaborate more effectively externally with our suppliers and other partners that we have as organizations? Collaboration has always been a very difficult challenge for organizations. And when you see what's happening on the the offline world or the non-business world in terms of the Facebooks and all the various social media that's out there that's allowing us to collaborate with friends that we haven't seen in 20 years, the question is, how do we bring that social media into our companies? We're scratching the surface today in many of these types of technologies. But what you're seeing here is that organizations are expecting that collaboration type of technology to be utilized to a much higher degree on a go-forward basis. When you look at, how do we drive the growth of our organizations? If we're going to grow that, growth of our organizations, we have to involve our suppliers in that. We don't do that in procurement. Our role is fundamentally changing from being less of a process executioner of sourcing process to being an enabler of business process. And to do that, we have to enable our suppliers and enable the processes like our product development processes in our businesses through our access to suppliers and supply markets. And one way that's is going to help that and enable that is some of the collaboration technology that's existing out there and will continue to evolve. If you go to the next slide, supplier networks. Supplier networks have been around for a number of years, and when we ask the question in terms of, to what degree are you going to be utilizing supplier networks in a number of different areas, and you see some of them here, how are we utilizing some of this today, and what is our expectation of how it will be utilized in 2 to 3 years from now, and where we see some of the biggest changes in terms of where we're going to maximize some of our, I'll call it past investments in some of these areas, is in the areas around networking. It actually goes back to what I was saying in the previous slide in terms of the collaboration. How are we going to network with our peers more effectively? To do a lot of things, to share information, potentially network with peers to share specific information about our suppliers in terms of their performance. Organizations are doing this to some degree today. But again, we're scratching the surface. How do we share information about risk? How do we share information about some of the challenges we have around the regulatory environment that we're all being challenged with? And it's not necessarily creating a competitive differentiation or advantage for us. Everybody has to do that. So how do we use some of these technologies and network more effectively that we can lower the economics of actually dealing with that type of environment? How do we collaborate and use these types of technologies to collaborate more effectively on our demand forecasts? So what we're going to see is much more utilization of some of these networks as we go forward. The next slide, outsourcing. Outsourcing is, has been one of those areas for the last 10 years that we have focused on in procurement, but we haven't seen a lot of, I'll say not as significant a development in outsourcing and procurement as we have seen in other functional areas like finance and IT and even HR. And what we're seeing, and we ask organizations, and across a number of different activities and processes, as you can see this vertical list here, how much of this activity today is being outsourced and being supported by a BPO partner? And then as we look forward over the next 2 to 3 years, what areas do you plan to outsource all or part? And what we find is that the area of greatest interest from a BPO or outsourcing perspective is in the area of supply market intelligence and using third parties to help us to gather some of that intelligence that we need. One of the things I think organizations need to think about is, where are we headed as an organization and what our competitive differentiation will be as we look forward. Is it truly going to only be around the processes that we execute, around sourcing execution, et cetera? Or will more and more of those processes around sourcing execution become more and more commoditized, especially in certain indirect and, even across many different categories? So the question then becomes is, where do we actually elicit more differentiation in our companies to gain a competitive advantage for our companies as we become more of an enabler of internal business process the focus on supply market intelligence becomes much more important. The question becomes is how do we enable those processes? In many cases, it's about intelligence. How do we get access? How do we get our arms around all of the information that exists out there and bring it and direct it to the processes internal to our business that can create advantage for us? If we go to the next slide, global business services. I mentioned earlier that one of the trends that we see out there is around global business services. We see that as a mega trend. The organizations are going to continue to figure out what activity should we have in these more centered types of environments. Doesn't mean it's all physically centered. It could be virtual, et cetera. But how do we bring that together to deliver our service in a much more efficient as well as effective way? And what should go into these centers? But there's challenges that we're facing in actually doing that. And what this slide here shows is that we ask organizations, of all these different types of activities, which ones do we consider to be critically important as part of our global business services, and which ones do we find that today we're very effective in actually doing that activity? And so the areas that we've identified as being the most important to us are around the alignment and how do we get better aligned with the overall goals of corporate. And this is really focusing on procurement within a GBS. At the same time, delivering of the services in a high-quality manner to the whole business itself, whether it be the functions or the individual BUs across the enterprise. Now, the two things I would point out here is, we're looking at importance as well as effectiveness. And so where you want to look at some of the gaps and where there may be some significant opportunities where we see things as critically important, but we don't believe that we're that effective in it today, we want to look at the size of the gap. Is the green bars much higher than the blue bars? If that's the case, then we have some gaps. There are areas that are very important to us, but we don't believe we're as effective as we should be in actually delivering it to the organization. And one of those areas is the alignment of procurement goals with corporate. Very important to us, but we don't believe that we're all effective with it today. The other area is increasing the scale and scope of the global business services. So as I talked about, the decisions that we have to make in terms of what goes into these centers, we see fairly large gaps in terms of we believe that this is very important to determine and figure out and do, but we haven't been all that effective in actually executing on it. Now there's a couple of areas where the green bar and the blue bar are essentially at the same level. And one of those areas is the delivery of productivity improvements within procurement. Today, we believe that's fairly important. We also feel, in an equally level way, feel that we're fairly effective in our ability to actually deliver on those productivity improvements within the procurement function itself. So if we go to the next slide, service placement. This is really asking the question in terms of where do we place services? These are key questions as we look forward in terms of how we actually deliver on a global basis or even within a country basis, et cetera. But where should we actually conduct some of this activity? Should all that activity be done at corporate? Should it be done in a center of excellence? Should it be done in a shared service center, a GBS, et cetera, or within the business? These are decisions that we have to make. And as we look at this, more of the activity in terms of what we've placed in some of these centers in our organization have been more on the transactional side and less on the knowledge-centric side. And as we look forward, what we're finding, and the question I ask here, are knowledge-centric roles destined to remain in-house? I don't believe that's the case. And what we're seeing here in the data, and it's all the way to the right where we see quite a large percentage of organizations when we look at knowledge-centric offshoring, knowledge-centric outsourcing, et cetera, that we're exploring this area. It's an emerging concept, and we're exploring what is the best way to go do that. In many ways, there's a bit of a question mark in terms of where some of this type of activity will reside on a go-forward basis. If we go to the next slide, we're focused on talent. And earlier today, I mentioned some things around talent. And what was interesting in this study, we asked organizations, as we look into 2014, procurement organizations, is what level of planned transformational change are you expecting within procurement over the next year? and specifically focus on your talent management practices. And what's interesting is, when we look at this, we ask them two things. Is it a comprehensive transformational change, or is it more of a moderate type of transformational change? And the area, by far, that came out as a comprehensive transformational change that organizations feel they need to make when it comes to different aspects of talent is in redefining the job profiles and competencies for their workforce within the function itself. Things are changing. The roles are changing. The expectations are changing. And what we're seeing now that's being reflected in 2014 is organizations are more and more focused on renewing and re-engineering the profiles and the competencies they believe they need to actually fulfill the expectations as we look going forward. If you go to the last slide, I have a few things just to sum up in terms of some of the trends that we've seen, and what I'm putting here is the top 5 trends to watch. 2014, as I said earlier, our top priority is expanding our influence. In many ways, we've been focusing on that 60% of the spend, on average, that we've been focusing on, and it's getting tougher and tougher to drive the kind of value back to organizations to, deliver on the expectations that continue to be ratcheted up by our enterprises. And for us to continue to, increase our value and specifically spend savings type of value, we have to expand our scope and ultimately finally get to a high degree of influence across the majority of the spend of our organizations. And I think that came through loud and clear this year as organizations see this, that they have to finally get this accomplished. When we came out of the downturn over the next several years, we saw a 10 basis point increase in the amount of spend being influenced by procurement organizations. What we have seen is that level off a bit. And I think what we're seeing here is that we're going to get back on it and we're going to start expanding it on a go-forward basis. Number 2 is we're going to have to continue to reinvent our value proposition back to the organization. It's continuing to change. As I was saying earlier, we're still going to deliver savings back to organizations, but organizations are focused on growth. And some of the things that we have been doing, we're going to have to reallocate some of that activity and some of that time to activities that allow our organizations to be successful in what they're focused on. And what they're focused on is growing the top line, growing the business in many different ways. And whether that's to support their innovation processes or help them come up with new innovative ways to go to market, we're going to have to figure out how we do that to align. And in many ways, it's going to force us to continue to reinvent our value proposition as an organization. Supplier networks, as I talked before, are going to be key enablers. Master data management, as well as analytics, in terms of helping us with many of these different types of activities. Organizations continue to search for the right combination of outsourcing, insourcing, offshoring, onshoring. What is the right balance? How much of our activity should be outsourced and how much should it remain in-house? Today, world-class organizations are less than 5% of the overall activity of the procurement functions being outsourced on average. When you look at other functions, it's north of 10%, and certainly in IT, it's you're seeing numbers in the 30 and plus range. So the question is, where is it in procurement? We're going to continue to optimize and determine what is the best way. If we're not hiring people, then we're going to have to figure out how we're going to deliver what we do and drive more value by reconfiguring how we actually do that. The last thing is, we believe that there's a shortage of great procurement talent today. And part of it is not necessarily that the talent we have is not good. The expectations of what we got to do is changing. So the question is, where are we going to find that talent? And how do we shape the talent that we have to be able to redefine the competencies that we actually need in many ways to move from being optimizers of processes to becoming innovators of services and products within our businesses. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Richard.
Thanks very much, Chris. Appreciate it. I think that's a great perspective for us all on the overarching enterprise-level themes that you mentioned of growth, innovation, productivity, and efficiency, as well as the procurement-specific trends and strategies. And what I wanted to do is kind of complement that by sort of drilling down further into actually some research that we've done on our own, some polling, a study that we've done over just the last couple of months, December and January, and are just releasing now. So this audience will get the first glimpse. This is the big reveal or the unveiling here. But this one is very specific to technology trends and adoption. Of course, Zycus is a provider of procurement performance, a suite of solutions for source to pay, enabling world-class and best-in-class performance. So we have a vested interest in taking the pulse of the market as regards technology investments and really checking those vital signs. So Pulse is our study, and I'm here to share the brand new results with you today. I'll tell you a little bit about the demographics for the study that we conducted. You can see the breakdown both in terms of revenue, the size of the companies, and the regions. And certainly it's primarily larger enterprises, so about 62% in total above $2 billion in revenue, although there's representation in more of a mid-market range as well, and also tends to skew towards North American-based and headquarter companies. But given the size, those include a number of multinational or global companies, as well as some companies actually headquartered outside of North America as well. And a statistically valid sample, over 300 respondents replied to this study on technology adoption and trends in technology. So I want to share some of those key results with you. It's first starting with some of the investment trends and looking at where folks have already made investments, where they already placed bets across the source-to-pay continuum with regard to technology. And looking at some of these results, it's not terribly surprising that spend analytics came out first. That's a logical starting point for most companies. A little bit surprising probably from our vantage point that contract management is quite as high, certainly relative to something like e-sourcing or procure-to-pay adoption. Certainly areas like sourcing and procure-to-pay in particular have very compelling return on investment business case scenarios. So you might have expected that to be a little higher. The other thing I would correlate there too, I know the survey that Chris shared indicated strategic sourcing as a #1 investment priority. And I think one of the things we're maybe comparing and contrasting here too is an investment in strategic sourcing may first be in talent, and maybe before the technology is getting that talent, and I know that's a point that Chris emphasized as well. But overall, you look at, for the most part, most of these solutions are better than 50% adopted with investments. But looking forward, where do folks plan to invest? I think this is very revealing as well, because you can see that they're focused on areas like supplier management and procurement process or performance management, perhaps a category that's somewhat less familiar than others. But this really talks about technologies that enable business process management in things like category management or financial savings tracking and management. And I think the key trend that comes through here is kind of a shift from a investment planning standpoint from more of the transactional aspects of technology enablement, whether it's ERFXs or POs or spend transactions, to a little bit more of the strategic relationship management around suppliers and strategic process management when it comes to category or financial savings tracking and management. So next we kind of looked at, of those the current state of technology adoption, what is the most common kinds of configuration out there? And we look at the current situation, there's almost 2/3 that are either homegrown or ERP. And kind of a lot of folks sort of making do with what they already have. So comfortable in maybe having been given lemons and they're doing their best to make lemonade. But if you look at kind of what are some of the future trends, or what do they want to change in the future, there's a clear mix shift that's being planned to go away from homegrown or embedded or incumbent ERP solutions to more procurement-specific solutions, or in fact perhaps an entire integrated suite of procurement-specific solutions, which is the leading future trend here on folks' wish list of where they'd like to go from a technology standpoint. Next, we took an interesting look here at correlating savings performance to technology adoption, and this is cumulative savings. So the way the survey was structured, it really asked folks, since you started taking an enterprise type or centralized management of your spend from a procurement standpoint, what are the cumulative savings that you realized? And we've broken this between, let's say, the folks on the lower end of the cumulative savings scale to see first what are they using today and where are they going forward. So here, fully 80% of the lowest cumulative savings achievement organizations are either homegrown or ERP systems, and clearly they want to change that profile in the future. If we contrast that with the high savings, so 20% plus in cumulative savings, certainly has a much lower incidence and almost sees the homegrown system in the future going out of existence entirely, and much more focus on a full suite of integrated procurement tools or procurement-specific tools that will be deployed to complement their current infrastructure. Next, we looked at the impacts of technology adoption as related to savings. And here we looked at user adoption across a few different dimensions. One is the centralized procurement group, enterprise procurement personnel, but then there's the folks out in the field who may be distributed procurement users, buyers out at plant locations and those kinds of things, and then end users or stakeholders that are outside of the procurement group altogether. And of course what we see, number one, is some different adoption patterns across those three different groups of users, but also very different profiles when it comes to savings achievement. And as I build the graph here, overall the trend is certainly upward. As you go into higher savings tiers, not surprisingly, adoption is much higher. So at the highest savings, you've got about 2/3 of procurement personnel, about 50%, greater than 50% of the distributed end users, and almost half of end users or stakeholders out in the business coming on as adopters of the technology, and a clear correlation to savings achievement. Another interesting result here is we asked respondents to look at adoption in terms of the type of features that are being configured, and starting with the baseline in the study that reflects the average kind of adoption rates. And as you, no surprise here that low ease of use and standard features is going to be the lowest, that organizations that are, or applications that are difficult to use are going to have low adoption. But the highest is actually around applications that have very high ease of use specific to standard features. So the inclusion of very complex advanced features can actually be a deterrent in some cases to adoption, that a robust set of standard features with high ease of use actually yields the greatest adoption overall. So here's the survey, and thanks to everyone for responding ahead of time. In our group here, we looked at what is your organization's typical sourcing cycle time, and you know, and both in terms of simple categories and more complex categories. And the results here from the survey group, about 1/3 would be less than 2 weeks, actually, for simple categories, so very rapid, but still a fairly high number, about 42%, over a month, even for fairly simple categories. And complex categories, not surprisingly, take much longer. About 3/4 take more than 2 months for those complex categories. Now, one of the things we looked at in our particular study here, the Pulse study, was correlating sourcing cycle times to the adoption of e-sourcing technology, and again broken between simple and complex categories. And you see the most dramatic cycle time reduction with e-sourcing in the area of simple categories. So just taking out the wait time and the touch time and distributing RFXs and getting bids back really drives cycle time reduction. A little bit surprisingly that it's not nearly as great on the complex categories, although I think what's really happening here is that with the powerful tools that are available for analytics, when it comes to a complex sourcing engagement, folks are taking their time to apply those tools, do multiple what-if scenario analysis to yield the optimal award decisions on the back end. So they're getting the benefit of the cycle time reduction and taking the manual activity out, but they're applying it to advanced analytics through the tool set. And then if we looked at order cycle times and business days, again, not surprising that there's a difference between simple categories and complex categories. And we've got the results here from the group that shows some are very very efficient in the way these are processed, whereas others, especially when it gets to complex, we've got almost a third that are greater than 30 days. And of course, from a customer satisfaction standpoint, I imagine those requisitioners are not that happy for orders that are taking more than 30 days to fulfill. And again, we looked at applying technology to the problem, so in this case, procure to pay, to reduce order cycle times. And very dramatic impacts, 40% cycle time reduction on an average basis, a weighted average of about 3 days for simple categories, and still about 13 days, and a less dramatic impact, about 17% on more complex categories. So some of the future expectations, let's look ahead, that came out in their survey. We asked respondents in the coming 5 years, what's the direction of where your procurement information needs are headed? And we saw some commonality in the responses. More than half said integrated across internal responses processes. A significant number, 41%, want that forward-looking predictive view, and they certainly want their data and intelligence, but also have it integrated with external market data, that supply market intelligence that Chris mentioned earlier. So anecdotally, this is just sharing some of the quotes we got from the survey participants, and highlighted in bold here are some of the things that came across that are common. A global data in a single snapshot, tightly integrated technology, big data analytics, integration across all the modules, and one-click metrics or dashboard to track these key issues. And I just wanted to share with you real quickly here how we've kind of responded to taking the pulse of the market and the customers, and taking those various modules that comprise a full source-to-pay suite capability and providing that one view, that single click that many of the respondents were asking for. And for example, having one place to go, one single view of a supplier relationship, for example, or perhaps a category. But in the supplier instance, one place to go where I can see how much am I spending with this supplier, how are they performing on a balanced scorecard basis, what are the current contracts and SLAs. So a single view or one view of critical information integrated across. And I'll just flip through and give you kind of a sense of what that looks like. It's a configurable dashboard where I could look at all of the key metrics around a particular supplier relationship and drill in at any point from this dashboard to get the detailed view of that information. And oh, by the way, if I'd like to have it on my mobile phone, this shows you a view of how I could tap through to get to, from a high-level view of a supplier or category that I want to analyze, down to actually a transactional level as needed. And for those who are interested in maybe getting a detailed demo of this capability, I just wanted to share that this will be something we'll be doing a week from tomorrow, and there's a link that's available, information available on our website as well to sign up with my colleague here, Zach, who will take you through a demo of that one view capability that so many folks seem to be asking for. And with that, I think we want to throw it up to questions, as well as at the end award a winner for all of the folks who participate in the survey, with a prize for one lucky winner who participated. Naomi?
Yes. Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Chris. That was really insightful and a great presentation. We've had quite a few questions, but we've only got a few minutes left, so we're just going to get through as many as possible. And if we don't get to answer your question, we will follow up directly with you. So first of all, I also just wanted to thank everyone for participating in yesterday's survey. And we do have a winner, and the winner is Stuart Andrews from Zycus Inc. So we will be sending you over a $50 Amazon gift card. And then over to the questions. The first question we have is for Chris, and that is, what value proposition trends are there that you see that go beyond savings?
Yeah, so when you look at value proposition, and one of the things several years ago, we actually put a research piece out talking about the evolving value proposition of procurement. And when we looked at a model of building this, we actually looked at a value proposition that actually begins prior to spend savings, and that is assurance of supply. We look at it as foundational, and that procurement organizations need to be able to assure a supply. And to do that, organizations and procurement organizations build capabilities to be able to deliver on that value proposition. So they were able to get the right stuff to the right place at the right time. And over time, it wasn't enough just to get the right stuff, right place, right time. We needed to also, that's where the whole cost-saving value proposition came into sourcing technologies, went out and got e-sourcing tools. We went out and started employing e-auctions and some of the marketing or sourcing that we were doing, et cetera. And these were things that we built to actually deliver on that value proposition back to the business. Now, beyond that, and one of the more logical steps beyond that is the whole focus on total cost. Right? And it's really looking at it beyond just price, but looking at total cost and all the various elements of cost, whether it's landed cost, whether it's life cycle costs, et cetera. Difficult to do sometimes, especially when you start thinking about life cycle costs, because we're crossing fiscal boundaries and budget years, et cetera, to get the business to make decisions that may be better long-term decisions, but not necessarily as attractive in terms of the short term and the budgetary impact that they may have. Beyond that is demand management, and many organizations focus on that. But sometimes it's just not necessarily I'll say, a pervasive capability across the organization. Many of us have focused on demand management and travel, and I'll say some of the more simple areas. But when it comes to some of the more complex areas, we're not necessarily shaping the demand of our organizations. And it's not just reducing demand. It's how do we shape it? We might want to shift it to another type of product, to another type of service. We may want to increase it because it's going to help us, from an overall business standpoint to increase our revenues, et cetera. But ultimately, a value proposition has to be in terms of how do we deliver, this additional value and service. And this is where we start looking at not necessarily shrinking the magnitude of the spend that we're actually focused on and managing as professional sourcing and procurement individuals, but it's also how do we get more value out of that. And so the value proposition of the function fundamentally changes. When we look at the function, and one of the comments I made during the webcast is that we shift ourselves from being less of an execution or a process. So for example, our 7-step sourcing execution processes, we execute those. We own those processes. We involve the rest of the business in those processes, and we execute and we deliver savings as our value proposition back to the organization. But as we expand that and we get more involved in supplier management and category management and really get aligned to the objectives of business and becoming less of an executioner and more of an enabler of business process, that value proposition changes. And it gets measured sometimes in, in terms of, revenue, innovation, in terms of what are the capabilities that exist within our supply base, and how do we identify who those suppliers that we want to look for and find, interesting capabilities that potentially can create an advantage for us that have nothing to do with how do we enable them to actually engage in some of our internal processes? You know, getting ourselves involved in joint ventures and mergers and acquisitions, and how do we, you know, go out and, you know, look for, you know, potential acquisition targets as a company, et cetera, are all different value propositions that procurement with its capabilities can be involved in and deliver back to the enterprise.
Thank you, Chris. That was really great. Great answer to the question there. Actually, we've pretty much run out of time, so we will not have time to go through any more questions. But as I mentioned before, we will follow up directly with anyone whose questions did not get answered today. And we just want to say congratulations again to Stuart Andrews, and we will send you your $50 Amazon gift card. Thanks again to Richard and Chris. Thanks.
Thank you.